Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 25th Women's Prize for Fiction. This isn't quite how I imagined celebrating our quarter century, but what is wonderful about doing this as a live event, the first day of 4 of our Women's Prize Digital Festival, is that I can see that we have readers joining us from all over the world, sort of Austria, Switzerland, Tunisia, North America, Italy, Switzerland. I've said Switzerland because another Switzerland's just come in. Hello, double Switzerland. I feel like I'm doing the Eurovision Song Contest. This is an amazing year for the Women's Prize for Fiction. When we set up the prize, our aim was simple. It was to put the beautiful, exquisite, dazzling, wonderful novels written in English by women from all over the world into the hands of readers that would love them. Over the past 25 years, there have been thousands of novels that have been entered, borrowed, bought, shared, loved, that have come through the Women's Prize and become part of our library, if you like. There's also been millions of readers all over the world who've joined in all of our events. And this year we have been able to, because we've had more time, to really celebrate the shortlist, an amazing shortlist we've got this year. We've been doing a Reading Women campaign, which celebrates all the previous 24 winners. On Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, you will find out who the 25th winner is. We've also been doing a lot of podcasting. We've been doing a lot of live events to make sure that exceptional books by women are shared the world over. We're also doing, finally, a journal that will celebrate all 25 winners. And you can see the Women's Prize team, thank you team, who are filling everything in the boxes down below. You can find out how to get involved with that and maybe have a journal for yourself. And what we hope is, of course, that anybody who maybe buys the journal for themselves, maybe it will be the beginning of your novel, that this will be the first time that you start to sketch out the idea for what you want to write. Because we're all readers on this call, but many of us are writers too. Wouldn't it be great if some of you watching, wherever you are in the world, decide today that you're going to start your novel? So we've got an amazing evening for you. We have 2 of the shortlisted authors, Hilary Mantel and Angie Cruz, who are already about to spring into action, I think, and be introduced to us. We're going to hear readings from their novels, Dominicana and The Mirror in the Light, and then short films that they've both made for us. Then we'll all talk together and we'll have time for your questions. So if you've got questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A function, and the Women's Prize team will gather them all up and then send them through to us. We've only got an hour. I know there'll be a lot to say. So the very short introduction to the 2 authors, I'm going to start with Angie Cruz. She is the author of 3 novels, Let It Rain Coffee, Soledad, and Dominicana, of course, which is inspired by her mother's story. She's received several fellowships, not least from the New York Foundation. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Asterix and associate professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. So the very first reading is from the wonderful Coral Peña, who is reading from Dominicana. Coral, you will know from 24 Legacy and, of course, the film The Post. And after that, there will be a short film from Angie herself. So over to you.
When I take a walk on Broadway, I pretend I'm balancing a book on my head. I sway my hips, looking into store windows in search of a fur coat and a string of pearls, some sheer stockings, and a patent leather purse. The store windows are crammed with old furniture in need of repair, piles of bed covers, sausages dangling bloody red at the meat shop. My reflection stares back at me, hair flat, no poof, no velvety bow barrette like Miss Kennedy's to hold my hair up. The strumming guitars and banging of drums loom close by. The crowd swarm around me, people holding signs. End war now. They shout in unison, this thing and that, pushing me ahead, a riptide under my feet. The banging of pots, the ominous sound of thunder. I should go home to avoid trouble, but I throw myself in, allowing the wave to lift and take me along, surrendering, peace for all. We march downtown against traffic, filling the streets, halting the delivery trucks, buses, and cars, our breaths in sync, The cars honk, the sirens wail. A helicopter dips low above us. The police hover nearby with clubs, waiting, waiting. They, like the marchers, multiply quickly. Lined up, the cops become a blue fence all along the sidewalks containing us. From my living room window, the protests seem loud and chaotic, but once inside of it, I feel weightless. A woman links her arm to mine, and I link my arm to a man next to me. They're much taller than me. We're like a school of fish, not losing our place, swimming against the current, alive. I can barely see anything. The mass of bodies pushing back the traffic, providing a shore for the march to break into. Turn back, Mama would say. Don't get involved with business that's not yours. But our arms looped one into the other get tighter, stronger. Suddenly we're sitting, the traffic jams. There's no turning back. I don't care that my skirt will be full of street dirt. Chants rip through my body. Together, we're strong. So strong. This is why we sit. This is why we say no. This is why we link arms.
What initially inspired me to write Dominicana was a story that was told to me since I was a child by my mother. Actually, I'm lying. It wasn't told to me. It was something that was said as if I wasn't in the room about how my mother and father got married. It was an arranged marriage. My mom was 15. He was twice her age. And it was arranged by my grandparents who really wanted to come to the United States so the family could have a better life. The thing about the story is that as I was growing up, I didn't really understand what it meant to make that sacrifice for my mother. I left the neighborhood at 19, and from that moment on, I didn't come back until recently. And I think that not being physically close to my mom, I think she felt that I probably didn't think about her. And I feel like this book in some ways is a Valentine to her. For her to see that I did see her, and also to reconstruct a story about women that's not being told. One that includes domestic violence, one that includes the challenges that working class women face, in particular Dominican women. Dominican women are very underrepresented in official archives, but also in all the mainstream narratives available to us. And I wanted to tell that story. Part of the research process included listening to someone's story, and from their story, sometimes it would be like, oh, come over, have a coffee. And I would say, could you have albums that I could look at? And then they would pull out their albums and they'll say, I haven't looked at this in so long. Through that, I mapped out the 1960s for Latinx women in this area. And, it was such a affirming experience for so many of these women who blocked out that story. I mean, it's been so long. And for them to think about that, their experience and during that time in history where the civil rights movement was happening. Also, the U.S. had occupied Dominican Republic. All these important, significant moments that they experienced, but they never actually were asked about. I thought, what if I could take those stories, inspire people to share those stories through Instagram? So I started this Instagram called Dominicanas New York City. And slowly it's been building with daughters, mostly from daughters and granddaughters who've been pulling photos from their personal archives and posting them and telling the stories of their mothers and grandmothers. This way, the book Dominicana has been a bridge builder, I think, for generations, where stories that are often maybe traumatic or seem insignificant are coming out of, the silence, I guess. So my writing process since the pandemic have changed dramatically. One, I used to write a lot more in transportation, right? Planes, trains, and automobiles. And since I've had to learn to sit still. And I think the stillness has been really good for me. I've been using my computer and not writing on my iPhone as much, which I think changes a lot. And I've been handwriting more because I've had an aversion to technology, which I think also slows down the narrative in a way that I think is really productive. But what I try to do to stay focused and inspired is that I keep certain books. A lot of times are poetry books that I could just read a poem and sort of like get myself started and think about language and its muscularity. But I also, have some objects that I've had with me for over 20 years. Many of them come from traveling. One particular one is the doll Dominicana, which is connected to the book. And it's a doll without a face. And the doll without a face represents the idea that Dominican women can look like any woman. We're made of all faces and all races. I always keep that doll nearby because it reminds me the complexity and the diversity of the community that I'm writing about.
That was an amazing film and a beautiful reading from Coral Peña. So next we're going to have a reading from The Mirror and the Light from Ben Miles, who many of you, of course, will know, played Cromwell in the RSE versions, the adaptations of Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies in Stratford and then in London and then in New York, and also recorded the audiobook. Hilary Mantel needs no introduction, as you know. She's the author of 15 books, including A Place of Greater Safety, Beyond Black, and the memoir Giving Up the Ghost, and the short story collection The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher. And her two most recent novels, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, both won the Man Booker Prize. And of course, this, The Mirror in the Light, is the third of that sequence telling the story of Blacksmith's son from Putney. So over to you, Ben Miles.
London, May 1536. Once the Queen's head is severed, he walks away. A sharp pang of appetite reminds him that it is time for a second breakfast, or perhaps an early dinner. The morning's circumstances are new, and there are no rules to guide us. The witnesses, who have knelt for the passing of the soul, stand up and put on their hats. Under the hats, their faces are stunned. But then he turns back to say a word of thanks to the executioner. The man has performed his office with style, and though the king is paying him well, it is important to reward good service with encouragement as well as a purse. Having once been a poor man, he knows this from experience. The small body lies on the scaffold where it has fallen. Belly down, hands outstretched, it swims in a pool of crimson, the blood seeping between the planks. The Frenchman they had sent for the Calais executioner had picked up the head, swaddled it in linen, then handed it to one of the veiled women who had attended Anne in her last moments. He saw how, as she received the bundle, the woman shuddered from the nape of her neck to her feet. She held it fast, though, and a head is heavier than you expect. Having been on a battlefield, he knows this from experience too. The women have done well. Anne would have been proud of them. They will not let any man touch her. Palms out, they force back those who try to help them. They slide in the gore and stoop over the narrow carcass. He hears their indrawn breath as they lift what is left of her, holding her by her clothes. They are afraid the cloth will rip and their fingers touch her cooling flesh. Each of them sidesteps the cushion on which she knelt, now sodden with her blood. From the corner of his eye, he sees a presence flit away, a fugitive, lean man in a leather jerkin. It is Francis Bryan, a nimble courtier, gone to tell Henry he is a free man. Trust Francis, he thinks. He is a cousin of the dead queen, but he has remembered he is also a cousin of the queen to come.
The research for the Cromwell trilogy, like all historical research, it really falls into two parts: texts and documents and the wider world. Now, I don't spend much time in libraries handling rare artifacts with white gloves. What I do is sit at my desk and summon up resources online, because while I've been writing the trilogy, every year more and more resources have been digitized. So it really saves legwork. Nevertheless, legwork is important because detail is no use without a context to put it in. And what I'm trying to do is build up a whole picture of the Tudor world. And so that means going to places and trying to cut away the modern world. Imagine what was there in the 1530s. And talking to people is important as well. The people who live there now will often throw up for you some unexpected insight. And then in a second, a piece of the book drops into place. For my writing process, the actual building of a novel, if you imagine an enormous notice board, higher than me and even wider than me, that's how I began when I wrote Wolf Hall. I physically had a wall with a pinboard on which I built my novel. So it was a question of, you have an insight, you have a snatch of dialogue or a phrase of description, put it down on an index card, pin it on the wall, and begin to build from there. And gradually you have a vast wall full of paper. And the beauty of this is it keeps it all loose, unstructured, till the last moment when you close the structure down. It's a wall full of fluttering possibilities. Well, then I moved house, partway through writing the trilogy. So that vast pinboard is now inside my head. What I do and how I write has changed completely during lockdown, because I've moved on from the novel to the stage play. And what I've been doing is preparing a stage version in collaboration with Ben Miles, the actor who played Cromwell in the stage version of the two earlier plays. Now, in ordinary times, if we'd been able to meet, we would have been on our feet playing at it. We would have been bouncing ideas around and writing down what we acted. We've worked like this before. But now, because of the constraints, we've had to build the whole thing by email, which is what we've done scene by scene, negotiating, compromising, getting agreement, and finally building a complete script. So we are ready to go when theatre comes back, which of course we all hope will be soon. When Seamus Heaney was dying, I'm told his last words were, "Don't be afraid." And someone's painted it on the gable end of a wall in Ireland. I have this photograph of it, which I cut out and I kept in the drawer of my desk during the writing of this last novel. It is what a writer needs to follow line by line. You need stamina, motivation. You need to strike out on your own path, and you need to take risks. That's what it's all about.
That Was absolutely beautiful reading, and so interesting hearing the differences between Angie and Hilary in terms of how they write. So we have Angie and Hilary both here, and I would love to be able to see you if they might be unmuted and brought back into the room. I don't know whether they've seen their films before, but it's extraordinary when you have to try and talk about your writing process in 5 minutes. Hello, Angie, lovely to see you. And Hilary, I think, is coming to join us as well. I think that we are maybe having a little technical difficulty getting Hilary back. But Angie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
And where are you at the moment?
Right now I'm in Pittsburgh, New York. I mean, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Right, I was about to say, I've done all my research and I didn't think that was...
Like my heart is in one place, my body's in another. It's very complicated.
It's very complicated. Hilary, hello, how lovely to have you here too.
Hello, I'm just in Devon.
Just in Devon, but Devon is good. Devon is good too. And as you were saying, you know, both of you were talking about your writing process. Just to start off, one thing for me, obviously these two novels are very, very different. For all the reasons that everybody can hear and when they've read. But at the same time, they both are a slice of a particular piece of history, Tudor history, the Tudor world that you have brought to life, Hilary, so extraordinarily. And Angie, for you, a sort of hidden and unheard and underheard history. So I wonder, just starting with you, Angie, what sort of sense of listening to your mother, listening to the stories, not actually ever really talking to her about her experience. How did you get the texture of her life? And how did you decide that you were going to put her story center stage as opposed to an imagined Dominican woman who was the amalgam of all the people that you were seeing on Instagram? Did you always know it had to be your mother?
Well, I was greatly inspired. That's a great question. I was greatly inspired by my mother's story because I felt that when I wanted to talk to her about it, she would say, it's such a typical narrative in her realm. And what's so interesting about it? And she kept not wanting to talk about it. But for me, researching, interviewing, listening to different women, in the end, Anna became an amalgamation of many, many women that I met and talked to. So when my mother read the book, she said, I recognize something, but it's not my story, but it feels true. And it was a really interesting, it was really helpful to me, and also a relief to know that she could read the book and see herself, but understand that this narrative is not her narrative anymore. It's a story that is encompassing all these different things. And you know, my family was not in New York City in the 60s. So all of that is made up.
Well, of course, because it is a novel, but Hilary was just talking about the Seamus Heaney and Don't Be Afraid. Were you afraid of what your mother would feel? You know, how did you, sort of coordinate, if you like, your responsibilities as a daughter and your responsibilities as a novelist to yourself and to the book?
Well, when I'm writing, I don't really think about anything but the character, and I try to really be true to what's happening to the character and the setting that I've chosen. But of course, I didn't want to hurt anybody, right? So I wanted to make sure that if I told this story in some way, she wouldn't feel offended or embarrassed or hurt. So I was a little afraid, but you know, I spent so many years working on this book, and part of the work of doing art is thinking about the complexity of a situation. And really all these characters, again, even though they might be slightly inspired by some stories that I heard, it's truly fiction. One of the things about my mother, for example, that I had asked her, I said, what is one thing you can't imagine ever happening to you? And she said, I don't think I'll ever fall in love. And when she said that, I said, I'm gonna have my character fall in love. So already having this narrative of love, as to me, as an act of resistance in this very difficult moment, created a fiction that for her she was living vicariously through this character. So for me, it all came around full circle.
Did you have a clear sense of the narrative in terms of what particular things were going to happen? You know, you talk about that period, the civil rights period. did you have certain, if you like, tent poles, I always think of them when I'm writing, you know, certain key moments of history that you knew you wanted Anna to engage with? Or did you actually just let the story find itself in that sort of way?
I decided to create a constraint of 1965. One, because I grew up right across the street from the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm X was assassinated. And that history was never taught to me until I went to the university, even though I was living right across from this really significant history that, you know, is important even to everyone that's involved in the African diaspora, like Dominicans. So for me, when I thought of 1965, which was also the year that the US occupied Dominican Republic, I said, okay, what can happen in that year for an immigrant, a new immigrant? So I did have that constraint, yeah.
And a final question before I go to Hilary. Was it the novel you thought you were going to write? When you had the idea of it, and you started, in terms of the emotion and the way the book worked, is it the novel that you thought you were going to write when you started?
No, you know, it took over a decade to write this book, especially because I felt that I needed to find a space of forgiveness for the men that did abuse the women in my family, in order for me not to write flattened characters. So that took a long time. And I guess that was the most surprising thing, that I did find through writing forgiveness.
You mentioned your mother's reaction. What about the men in your family then? Have they read it?
Well, you know, my father passed away a long time ago, but the younger generation of men, this book has been the first book that my entire family has read of mine. And they actually have, and this has been true for a lot of the readers that have come across this book. They said that the book has become a vehicle to talk about the things that have been silenced, like domestic violence in families. And this is true in my family too, where everyone's become more aware and empathetic toward the women, thinking, wow, this is something that, you know, maybe we could break the cycle, or we should be more mindful. Patriarchy, you know, it's like, it's a big machine. And I think that all of us in some ways are implicated, but I think men reading this book has been a really powerful experience.
Yeah, and as you said in your film, that beautiful sense of bridge building in many ways between readers and writers, between true stories and imagined stories and characters. It's a beautiful, beautiful novel. Hilary, you have, I mean, this is the most extraordinary sequence of books, but The Mirror and the Light, bringing it's the rise and rise and then the sudden fall, just 4 tiny years in Cromwell's life. When you started right at the beginning, did you have a sense of the time periods within each of the 3 novels? Or did you have a sense that the end needed to be quick and the beginning needed to be long? You know, how did you make that decision about the structure? Because the pinboard was, you were talking about your wonderful pinboard for this novel, but what about the pinboard of the 3?
It wasn't planned as a trilogy. It was to be encompassed in one book. That was the initial idea. And it was when I was a little way into Wolf Hall that I understood the complexity of the material, and it flowered out from the middle. So there wasn't a plan, except that once I knew it was going to be a trilogy, then the division of the 3 was fairly self-evident. But there is a way in which, when I began and wrote the first page, I looked right through a magic mirror to the last page, because I knew how the end would be. And in that sense, the whole project, 15 years of writing, it was all present in 15 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, and the incredible texture of the beginning of the novel, which we heard from Ben Miles. I'm so glad that we heard the beginning of the novel, but that sort of sense of the story of blood, if you like, from the very beginning to the very end. It's that kind of texture that is so extraordinary, because of course Angie was talking about, he's telling underheard and unheard stories and putting something in the record that's been missing, whereas you are animating a piece of history that possibly more than any other piece of history, is known, that Tudor period. So that sense of the texture of life is through all of the books, but I think very vivid in here. You said you didn't particularly look at objects, but it was kind of your desk, you know, sitting at your desk. So was it always that you knew that you had to get that sort of texture onto the page, or did that come as you were following him? Was he your guide or were you his?
I think very much I was taking Cromwell as my guide, because when you engage with any fictional character in a big way, you put your own senses in a subordinate position to theirs. You get inside their head, you look through their eyes, even your sense of touch becomes subordinate to theirs. It's a question not of how do you experience the world, but how do they experience it? And with Cromwell, okay, he's been in Italy, the home of the luxury fabrics. He dresses kings and queens. It's very sensuous. It's very much a textual vocabulary of richness. There's cloth, there's blood, there's water. All the stories are borne along on the River Thames, and the river has its deeps and its mysteries. And although the book is pegged very firmly to the historical record, there are still subterranean depths within the hearts of the people whom the record concerns. And we swim around below the surface.
Were there characters as you carried on writing the sequence, and obviously particularly in this third one, that you found yourself writing more about, and others that you wrote less about because they'd lost their luster for you? Or did you always have everybody as actors almost, that they had to play their part?
Sometimes you realise they've been standing in the wings for quite a long time. I have a huge cast here, and part of the work in this trilogy has been keeping tabs on people. Yes. Where are they when they drop off the record? And can you fairly and plausibly bring them into a scene? And you want to do that, and then you find, oh no, he's in Calais. Okay, how quickly can he get back? Presuming the tide's in his favour and the winds are helpful. You're all the time constrained like that, but it's a creative sort of constraint. It makes you cunning, it makes you ingenious, and it keeps the drama lively, I think. You have this huge cast to be in command of. And I must admit, it's some of the really awful characters I enjoy writing most. I love writing Richard Rich. I love writing Stephen Gardner. It's when the betrayers or the opponents, the slaughterers, when they're on the page, it's the conflict that keeps it lively, keeps it sharp.
And that, of course, is why the stage adaptation and indeed the television adaptation is so exciting, because that's the nature of theatre, that there's always, you know, that clashing. You mentioned that you worked with Ben Miles. I'm fascinated by the fact that he is so involved in the putting onto the stage of the work. Was that from the get-go, in the very first, the beginning of the amalgamation of Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, was he always that involved? You know, was he your, you know, fellow writer, if you like?
It was a sort of creative practice that evolved between us as I sat in on rehearsals, and as those initial shows changed as they moved to different theatres and finally moved to New York. There was a lot of rewriting going on, and obviously when you've got your cast there, you're going to work in conjunction with them because they have intuitions, skills that they can bring to the process. And I think it started as a way of fixing things up. But then it became much more than that. And I wasn't the original writer for the first two plays.
No.
But with this one, it seemed obvious that Ben and I should give it a go, because we had, we discussed the character so intensively. Ben had lived with him, had a lot of insights that I got in rehearsal, fed into the book at a real micro level. You know, I remember in the reading Ben did about Anne Boleyn's execution, there's the cushion on which she kneels, sodden with blood. And I remember seeing in rehearsal, an early rehearsal, a young actor just kick that aside. And immediately I thought, you can't do that. It's heavy. It's full of blood. Yeah. So that's how the process worked. It was a really productive loop. The emerging novel feeding into the plays, and the plays feeding into the emerging novel. And I had two notebooks all the time. One was for what was going on in the rehearsal and the play we were doing, and the other was for the insights I could capture for The Mirror and the Light.
But did you worry at all, though, that as you were writing your Cromwell of book 3, that you were actually now writing Ben? You know, what was the grief for your imagined Cromwell, the real Cromwell, and now Ben? You know, there's 3 of them in the marriage, as it were.
No, it didn't really work that way. I think you always have to separate yourself from the character you're writing, because you have to be able to stand back and judge. And this is essentially, it's about representation. And I'm always clear that Ben is Cromwell's representative. He is not Thomas Cromwell.
Well, we've got loads of questions coming in. So I'm going to ask some of them. I'm going to get through as many as we possibly can. If we don't ask yours, please forgive us. It's just that several of the questions cover the same ground. And both Hilary and Angie have been so articulate already about your writing process. Some of the questions have fallen as we've been talking. But we're going to start. We have Mahasuda Smith. She says to both of you, what do you think is the difference between literary and commercial fiction? And did you ever struggle fitting into a genre or deciding what genre you were in? Angie, do you want to start with that maybe?
Sure. I actually, I always, you know, I teach creative writing, and I always say I'm in the business of art. And I find that literary fiction to me is about pushing what the novel can do. Is it topically or aesthetically? So I think the big difference is that when you want a commercial novel, you might make compromises to make it more accessible for mass consumption. But I think that to do that means that you're actually giving up maybe some of the things that you really believe in. And so for me, like, when I think about my work, I think more about it, about innovation. And that's where literature to me is.
Yes, and the simplicity of line, the really beautiful simplicity of line that you have all the way through. Hilary?
To my surprise, I found that I had broken down this supposedly hard and fast division between what's literary and what's commercial. And I'm more inclined to think in terms of good and bad books, which there can be across all genres. And a good book is simply a book you can read twice.
That will now destroy all bookshop categorizations, obviously. They're going to be flinging the books off the shelf in order to recategorize. And it will be like a color palette from good to bad, however we do that. A question from Laura is asking both of you, what books have you been enjoying, both of you, in lockdown? Has your reading changed in lockdown?
I hadn't read fiction for quite a time, and I suddenly found that because I wasn't traveling, I wasn't on the move so much, And I wasn't writing a novel myself, so I could sit down and read fiction in the evenings. I've been reading all sorts of things. The last book I read was Edith Wharton's The Custom of the Country. I enjoyed every page of it. I absolutely adored it. Undine Spragg, if you haven't met her, you've got to meet her. I've been reading Elizabeth Taylor. I've just read In a Summer Season, a book of hers that I hadn't read before. I'm keeping up with new books as well, things that come in proof.
Yeah, lovely. Angie?
You know, I have to admit the quarantine has made my attention span shorten, especially because I've been in quarantine with a 12-year-old. So, which means that we read in tandem. So that includes reading YA and middle grade books with him. But I also have been really appreciating some of the shorter novels in translation. So right now I'm reading a Clarice Lispector novel in translation, The Hour and the Star, and Mario Bellatin, who wrote The Nose of Shiki Nakawaka. But yeah, the short novel for me right now has been a saving grace in the way that it makes me feel like I could still enter into a story, and also honor the fact that I'm so busy with this virtual life. Yeah. And, you know, and I have a 12-year-old, so.
Yeah, no, you need go no further. I obviously read a lot of fiction, not least of all for the Women's Prize, but I, for the first time in my life, have read almost exclusively non-fiction through the lockdown for some reason. It's just, you know, that's where I kind of wanted to find out what people were saying now and thinking now. So, right, we have another one from Alexandra Love. Both books give stories based on actual events and portray women who were constricted by patriarchy, but who, with what means they had, tried to fashion their own identities. What was the most challenging and what was the most uplifting about writing them? Maybe Angie, you start with that.
Well, like I said earlier, I mean, I think one of the difficult things was, you know, it's true, I'm really angry at men. Men have made my life impossible. Everything from not being able to move in spaces in a certain way, feeling constantly sexualized by them, being a victim of trauma and abuse. So I think that the hard part for me, in particular in this book where everything is so explicit, is to write in a way where I could contextualize why things are happening, right? So in fact, my character Juan, in the first draft, was a very unlikable character. And and then one day I woke up and I said, I want people to read this book, to finish it and not just throw it against the wall. So I gave him a gift, which is to sing. I said, if he has something beautiful that he can give the world, maybe there's a way that people can open their minds to see him not just as an abuser. And the truth is that, even the men that have done horrific things that I've known are loved by so many people. And that's also the tension around a culture that we know these things are happening. We know that men should be held accountable, but yet they're still revered in all walks of life and all systems. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Hilary, I have a question for you actually that is quite specific. It's the Edinburgh Writers' Forum would like to ask about the significance of feathers in the trilogy, and they think you might be wearing peacock feathers pattern.
Yes, I am wearing peacock feathers. Yes, the second book, Burning Up the Bodies, begins with a scene of falconry, a sort of riot of flying feathers and blood. Something very airy, very delicate here, something we associate with the feminine, but equally well worn by men in those days. Animals and birds, all kinds of creatures represent the flow of unconscious life in the book. Sometimes benign and affectionate, sometimes savage.
Yes, and it's, I think that obviously for people who've read all of the books, seeing that thread through is so incredibly important. A question from several people here about editing. Hilary, you've talked about the fluttering on the board. and the ideas, but then the editing of big text. And Angie, you've talked about writing over 10 years. So could you both say a little bit about how you go about the difference between a first draft, a second draft, an edited draft, and how long that process takes?
I'm not conscious anymore of separate drafts. And I don't think I've thought in those terms ever since I started writing on the screen, which was way, way back in the mid-80s. And what I do now is work over everything I write intensely, maybe 20 times, 30 times, but I do it in blocks of scenes rather than chapters. When I've created a dramatic structure, then it's important for me to look at it as a structure, but also to look at it sentence by sentence. And if necessary, if difficulties come, then to read aloud, because if you have a lapse or falling away in rhythm or energy, then that is what will give you your solution.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it's like picking up a stitch almost, building it as you go along. Angie, what about you? You said it's taken 10 years. Is it a different process or a similar process to Hilary?
It's different. I have to say, Hilary, when you were talking about building your novel and the cast of characters, I was just like, oh, does she put all the parts of the story on the wall? How does she keep track? Do you write it down? Do you keep notebooks? Because it feels like such a big cast, and I'm really curious about how you do that. But for me, so this book, I wrote it on different number of versions. One, because there was a story I wanted to write, and then it's the story that wanted to be written. And it took a few drafts before I realized that the story wanted to be told by Anna. It wasn't originally told by Anna. It was told in third person, and the camera had been pulled back pretty far away because I wanted to give a sense of this historical moment, which I thought was incredibly important to tell too. And when she told the story, then I had to then edit it around language. I said, oh, everything that's being said in this book is in Spanish. So my language is English. So then I had to really go in and play with the language so it was clear that it was her voice. So there were many, many different kinds of layers in revision. Yeah.
Do you want to answer, Hilary, Angie's question?
Well, bear in mind, I said the pinboard's inside my head now. But what I would do, having got those first index cards with the little phrase or snatch of dialogue, I would begin to build a story up behind them. That scene would accrete more and more detail. And so I would have a whole scene behind the card. Then gradually, because remember, you're seeing this every day, you begin to rearrange it. Every time you go past, you have a little intuition, you do a bit of rearranging. And then will come the day called second pinning, where you grab something and you completely change its position. And the book begins to find its form. You know what's flashback, you know what's foreground action. And I would leave it as late as possible then to put it into ring binders, which again is still leaving it loose. You must never drive yourself forward on one line in a hard spine notebook. So I was evolving this system before we worked on a keyboard, before we worked on a screen. Then gradually, as you acquire a technological means of moving text around, and you get more adroit at doing it in your head. You don't actually need the physical wall, which is a relief because you haven't always got that space.
Not a big enough wall, certainly.
Nothing would be big enough for the trilogy. I would have had to move to a palace.
Well, Hampton Court, I'm sure, would be available. There is a question that follows on in a way from that. from Ruth Moore, who says, were there times in the writing of the trilogy when fear nearly held you back from continuing on such a big endeavour?
Well, hence Seamus Heaney. Don't be afraid, which I think is good advice for every writer, because you need courage to begin every day, to pick up what you did yesterday and appraise it, or to face the blank page or the blank screen. You always have to break down a barrier of anxiety. And I wish I could tell people that goes away, but it doesn't. If anything, it builds. There's so much at stake. And you have to break through that barrier on a daily basis. So yes, there were times when I was afraid. And there were times when my physical stamina, my health seemed to fail. I was significantly ill and hospitalized partway through writing the trilogy. But you have to find a way of working around real life, around these physical constraints, around whatever else may happen. I was very moved by what Angie said about her book, because partway through the writing of The Mirror and the Light, my mother died, and I began to think very much about my connections to her, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. The untold stories started to overwhelm me, but there's a time and a place. You have to again have the courage and faith to continue your narrative, knowing that you can put those thoughts on a high shelf. They will be there for you. They're not going anywhere. Yes. They're embedded in you. They're inside you anyway. They are what you are. So you can access them when you need to. It's easy to get overwhelmed by material, I find.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Angie, does that chime with you as well?
Yeah, I love research. So I could spend and get lost in all the material and the autobiographies of my characters, and I go back and forth, and I think sometimes it's to pin down where the story begins and who tells the story is sometimes the hard part for me, because I'm so interested in so many different aspects of the narrative.
And there's a question that's come in along those lines about from Sue Johns, who says that there are various things that are very important cultural touchstones for Anna, food being one of them. Is that drawn from your personal experience? Was that one of the ways that you got texture in?
You mean the inclusion of food?
Yeah, well, no, that it's very important for Anna. The question is, she feels that it's very important. It's a cultural touchstone for Anna in the novel.
Well, I was really interested in acts of resistance in domestic life. I think sometimes people will take for granted or discount what it means to be at home and that labor and visible labor that happens at home. And I felt that in the cooking, that was an opportunity for Anna, one, for us to see a possibility for her, a way out of, or financial independence, but also it was where she was creative and innovative. So we could see also how her mind works, how she might be able to hustle to her survival. So that's why I included the food. But I do think that for me, food is, I love food and it's important. But also I think that, yeah, for me, it was like about acts of resistance.
Yeah. We're nearly out of time. This has gone so quickly, but I think it's really important just to ask both of you what you're writing now or what you will be writing. Hilary's obviously talked about the adaptation, and we all hope our theatres are going to be back very, very quickly. But what are you both working on now as novelists, if you like?
I'm going to have a look at some short stories which have got halfway there while I was writing The Mirror and the Light, but I had to put away. Some of them possibly have potential. I can't say they'll all come to fruition, but that's my project, to give myself this different form of work. As for novels, Yeah, I have so many ideas, and I don't want to tie myself down because I have a terrible record of promising one book and delivering something completely different. So it will probably be futile at this point to make any predictions.
So we will be looking for a volume of poetry, very slim, perhaps. Angie, what about you? What are you working on?
I'm finishing up a novel called The Immigrant Handbook, about women in their 50s who were just laid off from working at a factory during the recession in 2007 in the United States. So yeah, that's what I can say for now.
And are you both, you know, we talked about reading in lockdown, and for a lot of writers, myself included, I found it very hard to get my creative chops back. You know, to start with, I found it very hard to write creatively. Have you found that, or have you been able to actually separate what's happening outside the Zoom world and your own imaginations? Angie?
I have found this moment to be incredibly creative for me. I mean, I try to be, again, like forgiving to myself if I can't show up in the same way, because I am never alone anymore. So it's a different kind of way of working. But I like to think that, you know, I could make time for it. And I feel like Zoom has been challenging because we can't be in real life, but also it's so exciting that there's people from all over the world attending this event. Thank you all for being here. It's just amazing. And that could have not happened in person. So
yeah. Hilary?
Yes, I second that. It's not the way of working that one would first choose. I love the contact with a live audience, but it is great to feel that we're all connected. It's very much in a way that you imagine your reader when you write. And now we have this kind of verification that, yes, they're out there, they're listening tonight. I haven't noticed a falling off in creativity. I think I just have a secret factory humming away inside that is very much independent of what's happening in the outside world. But I've liked the chance to do some extra reading, because for writers, reading is also a creative activity.
Yes, well, that is a beautiful way to finish, I would say. It has been amazing to listen to you both, Angie Cruz and Hilary Mantel, and you've been so generous with your thoughts. And I wish we were all in the same space, but as everybody's saying, it is extraordinary that we have had people listening in from this in Australia, in Canada, in Tunisia, in Switzerland twice, as I said, in Italy, all over the world. And that is really important, because in the end, we are connected by the stories that we share and that we read. It's been wonderful, you all engaging so much. And I think we're going to try and keep some of that sense of everybody being in the same room all over the world as we go forward. Tomorrow night, I'll be back, and I will be with Maggie O'Farrell and Natalie Haynes, and we will be talking about Hamnet and 1,000 Ships, and the readers will be Indira Varma and Anne-Marie Duff. But for tonight, for day one of our 4-day digital festival, this is good night from the Women's Prize, and good night from Angie Cruz and Hilary Mantel. Thank you all so much for joining us. Good night.
good night.